Sarah Mitchell thought she was marrying the love of her life. She had no idea she was walking into the most dangerous wedding ceremony in modern history. What started as a dream destination wedding in the mountains of Colorado would end with 12 deadly weapons, 3 dead bodies, and a bride whose true identity would shock even the FBI.
This isn't a story about love gone wrong.
This is a story about deception so deep, so carefully planned, that it took federal investigators 2 years to unravel the truth. When the smoke cleared and the last shot was fired, everyone would ask the same question. Who was Sarah Mitchell really, and how did she turn a wedding into a battlefield? The answer would change everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the length someone will go to protect a secret that could destroy everything. The morning sun painted the Rocky Mountains gold. As Sarah Mitchell stood on the balcony of the luxury cabin, watching her wedding guests arrive one by one, cars wound their way up the mountain road like a slow parade, each one carrying people she had carefully selected for this special day. What none of them knew was that Sarah had chosen each guest for reasons that had nothing to do with love or friendship. David Chen, her groom, was still sleeping in the cabin below. He believed he was marrying Sarah Mitchell, a freelance photographer from Portland who had swept into his life 8 months ago with her bright smile and mysterious past. David worked as a software engineer for a tech company, lived a quiet life, and thought he had found his perfect match in the woman who loved hiking, cooking, and long conversations about everything and nothing. But Sarah Mitchell didn't exist. The woman David knew as Sarah was actually Elena Vasquez, a former intelligence operative who had spent the last 3 years running from people who wanted her dead. The mountain wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was the final move in a deadly game that had been playing out across 3 continents. As guests began gathering in the main lodge for the morning breakfast, Elena watched each arrival through binoculars. There was Marcus Thompson, David's best friend since college, who had driven up from Denver with his wife Jennifer. Marcus worked as an accountant and had no idea that his presence at this wedding would put his life in danger. Jennifer, a kindergarten teacher, was excited to meet Sarah's family, not knowing that every person Sarah claimed as family was actually part of an elaborate cover story. Elena's supposed sister Maria had arrived the night before. In reality, Maria Santos was Elena's former partner from their days working black operations for a government agency that officially didn't exist. Maria knew exactly why they were here, and the black duffel bag she had carried into her cabin contained more than wedding decorations. Then there was Father Rodriguez, who would be performing the ceremony. The elderly priest had driven up from Colorado Springs, believing he was officiating a simple mountain wedding. What he didn't know was that Elena had chosen him specifically because his schedule meant he would leave immediately after the ceremony, before things got complicated. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Carlos, another former operative who was posing as her uncle. The message was brief. They're coming. 3 vehicles. Eastern approach. Elena felt her heart rate increase, but her face remained calm. She had been expecting this moment for months. The people hunting Elena weren't just anyone. They were part of a criminal organization that she had helped expose during her last official mission. That mission had gone wrong in spectacular fashion, leaving several international criminals dead, and Elena with information that could bring down an entire network of illegal arms dealers. The problem was that some very powerful people wanted that information buried, and they wanted Elena dead. David appeared on the balcony behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Nervous about the big day?" he asked, kissing her neck gently. Elena leaned back against him, feeling genuinely sad for what she was about to put him through. David was a good man who deserved better than being caught in the crossfire of her past. "Just excited," she lied, turning to face him. "I love you." And surprisingly, that part wasn't a lie. Over the past 8 months, Elena had fallen genuinely in love with David Chen. He was kind, funny, and completely different from anyone she had ever been with. In another life, in another world where she wasn't running from killers, she might have actually married him for real. "I love you too," David said, and Elena's heart broke a little more. The next few hours passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Elena played her part perfectly, laughing with the bridesmaids who didn't know her real name, discussing flowers with David's mother, and greeting guests as if this was the happiest day of her life instead of potentially the last day of several people's lives. Maria found Elena in the bridal cabin as she was getting ready. "Everything's in place," Maria said quietly, checking to make sure they were alone. "Carlos has the perimeter secured, and Jake is in position near the chapel." Jake Morrison was the 3rd member of Elena's team, a former Army Ranger who specialized in explosive devices and long-range surveillance. To the wedding guests, he was Sarah's cousin from Seattle who worked in construction.
How much time do we have?
Elena asked, stepping into her wedding dress. The white gown was beautiful, but sewn into the bodice was a thin layer of body armor, and hidden in the folds of the skirt was a small but deadly knife. Maybe an hour before they reach us, Maria replied. Are you sure about this plan? Elena looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like any other bride on her wedding day, radiant and happy. No one would suspect that she was about to turn a wedding ceremony into a battlefield. David and the other guests need to be protected, Elena said firmly. These people won't hesitate to kill innocent bystanders to get to me. At least this way, we control the situation. The plan was complex but necessary. Elena's team had spent weeks preparing the wedding venue, hiding weapons and planning escape routes. When the criminals arrived, they would be expecting to find Elena alone or perhaps with minimal security. Instead, they would walk into a carefully prepared trap. But first, Elena had to get married. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. in a small chapel on the property. Elena had chosen the location specifically because it had multiple exits and good sightlines for her team to monitor approaching threats. The chapel could hold about 50 people, but Elena had kept the guest list small. The fewer innocent people in danger, the better. As the time approached, Elena made her final preparations. She checked the communication device hidden in her bouquet, confirmed that her team was in position, and said a silent prayer that somehow everyone would survive the next few hours. David was waiting at the altar when she walked down the aisle, and his face lit up when he saw her. For a moment, Elena almost forgot about the danger closing in around them. She almost believed that she really was just Sarah Mitchell, marrying the man she loved in a beautiful mountain chapel. Father Rodriguez began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment. Elena listened to the vows, knowing that in a few minutes, everything would change forever. She had to time everything perfectly. The criminals would arrive during the ceremony, expecting to catch her off guard. Instead, they would find themselves trapped in a chapel with some of the most dangerous people they had ever encountered. As David began his vows, Elena saw Carlos's subtle hand signal from the back of the chapel. Their enemies had arrived. I promise to love you, honor you, and protect you for the rest of our lives, David said, completely unaware that in the next few minutes, Elena would be doing exactly that, in ways he could never imagine. Elena's response was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming outside the chapel. The guests turned curiously toward the noise, but Elena's team was already moving into position. Maria had quietly moved toward the front exit, while Jake had slipped out the side door moments earlier. Is everything okay? Father Rodriguez asked, looking confused by the sudden tension in the air. Elena looked at David, seeing the confusion and growing concern in his eyes.
I'm sorry, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear.
Then she reached into her bouquet and pulled out a small pistol, just as the chapel doors burst open and armed men flooded inside. The wedding guests screamed and dove for cover as Elena's carefully planned battle began. But this was only the beginning of a fight that would reveal secrets, test loyalties, and change the lives of everyone in that mountain chapel forever. Elena raised her weapon and fired her first shot, officially beginning the most violent wedding ceremony in Colorado history. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful mountain air and changed everything forever. Elena's bullet found its target, dropping the lead gunman before he could fully enter the chapel. The wedding guests, who moments before had been watching a romantic ceremony, were suddenly scrambling for their lives as bullets began flying in every direction. David stood frozen at the altar, his mind unable to process what was happening. The woman he thought he knew, the gentle photographer who loved quiet mornings and homemade pasta, was moving with deadly precision through the chaos she had created. Elena rolled behind the altar, using her wedding dress to conceal her movements while she assessed the situation. 4 more armed men had entered the chapel after their leader fell. They wore tactical gear and moved like professionals, but Elena's team had the advantage of preparation and positioning. Maria emerged from her hiding spot near the front pews, firing controlled shots while using the heavy wooden benches as cover. Her bullets caught one of the intruders in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a wall. Jake's voice crackled through Elena's earpiece from his position outside the chapel. 3 more vehicles approaching from the west. At least 8 more hostiles. You've got maybe 2 minutes before they surround the building. Elena's mind raced as she calculated their options. The chapel had become a death trap, but they couldn't abandon the innocent guests who were caught in the crossfire. David's mother had crawled under the piano, sobbing in terror. Marcus and Jennifer were huddled behind overturned chairs, Marcus trying to shield his wife with his body, while looking at Elena with complete confusion and growing horror. "David, get down!" Elena shouted, as another volley of bullets splintered the wood above his head. Her groom finally snapped out of his shock and dove behind the altar with her. "Sarah, what the hell is happening?" David demanded, his voice shaking with fear and betrayal. "Who are these people? Who are you?" Elena wanted to explain everything, but there wasn't time. One of the gunmen was advancing toward their position, using the chapel pews for cover while firing systematically at anything that moved. Elena popped up and fired twice, her shots forcing him back but missing their target. "I'll explain everything later," Elena promised, checking her ammunition. "Right now we need to get everyone out of here alive." Carlos appeared at the side entrance to the chapel, carrying what looked like a small black cylinder. Elena recognized it immediately as a smoke grenade, part of their emergency evacuation plan. Carlos caught her eye and held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The smoke grenade detonated in the center of the chapel, filling the space with thick white smoke that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Elena grabbed David's hand and began moving toward the side exit, calling out to the other guests to follow her voice. "Everyone stay low and move toward the sound of my voice," Elena shouted over the chaos. "We're getting out of here." The smoke provided cover, but it also made it difficult for Elena's team to coordinate their movements. She could hear Maria calling out positions and Jake's updates about approaching vehicles, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. They had planned for a fight, but not for this many enemies arriving at once. Elena reached the side door with David just as fresh gunfire erupted from outside the chapel. Jake's voice came through her earpiece, tight with urgency. "They've got the building surrounded. We're pinned down." Through the smoke, Elena could see Marcus helping his wife toward the exit while Father Rodriguez attempted to assist David's mother. The elderly priest was moving slowly, clearly shocked by the violence that had erupted during what should have been a sacred ceremony. "There's a service tunnel that runs under the chapel," Elena told David as they reached the side door. "It leads to the equipment shed about 100 yards down the hill. We can use it to evacuate everyone." David stared at her through the smoke, his face showing a mixture of fear, confusion, and growing anger. "You planned this," he said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "All of this. You knew this was going to happen." Elena's heart broke at the accusation in his voice, partly because it was true, and partly because she could see their relationship dying in real time. "I tried to protect you," she said. "I tried to keep you out of this, by lying to me. By bringing killers to our wedding?" David's voice was getting louder, his shock giving way to fury. Before Elena could respond, the side door exploded inward as more armed men breached the chapel from multiple directions. The smoke was beginning to clear, giving the attackers better visibility while leaving Elena's group dangerously exposed. Maria's voice cut through the noise.
"Elena, we need to move now."
"They're preparing to storm the building." Elena made a split-second decision that would haunt her for years afterward. She pushed David toward Father Rodriguez and David's mother, knowing that the attackers were specifically after her, not the innocent wedding guests. "Get them to the tunnel," she ordered Marcus, who despite his terror was helping coordinate the evacuation of the civilians. "The entrance is behind the organ. There's a hidden panel in the floor." "What about you?" David asked, even in his anger still concerned for her safety. "I'm going to buy you time," Elena replied, checking her remaining ammunition. She had 2 full magazines left, plus the knife hidden in her dress. It would have to be enough. Elena kissed David quickly, tasting tears she didn't realize she was crying. "I really do love you," she whispered. Everything else was a lie, but not that. Then she turned away from him and moved back into the smoke-filled chapel, where Maria and Carlos were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. The battle that followed would be talked about by law enforcement officials for years afterward. Elena and her team, outnumbered 3-1, managed to hold off their attackers long enough for the wedding guests to escape through the hidden tunnel, but the cost was devastating. Carlos took a bullet to the chest while covering Elena's advance toward the main entrance. He went down hard, his weapon skittering across the floor as blood pooled beneath him. Elena reached him just as another wave of attackers burst through the front doors of the chapel. "Get out of here!" Carlos gasped, trying to hand her his spare ammunition. This isn't worth dying for. But Elena knew it was worth dying for, because the information she carried could save thousands of lives if it reached the right people. The arms dealers they were fighting weren't just criminals. They were supplying weapons to terrorist organizations around the world. Elena's intelligence could shut down their entire operation. Elena took Carlos's ammunition and continued fighting, moving through the chapel like a deadly dancer in a wedding dress. She used every piece of cover, every angle, every trick she had learnt in years of covert operations. Maria was doing the same from her position near the altar, but they were slowly being overwhelmed. Outside the chapel, Jake was holding off the reinforcements with explosive devices he had planted around the property. Each explosion shook the building and bought them precious seconds, but Elena knew they couldn't hold this position much longer. The end came suddenly. One of the attackers managed to flank Maria's position, catching her in the open as she tried to reload. Elena saw it happening and screamed a warning, but it was too late. Maria went down with multiple bullet wounds, her body falling across the chapel steps where Elena had walked as a bride just minutes earlier. Elena felt something inside her snap. The careful, professional operative disappeared, replaced by someone driven by pure rage and grief. She emerged from cover, firing rapidly at the remaining attackers with deadly accuracy. Her bullets found their targets with mechanical precision, dropping 2 more gunmen before her weapon clicked empty. The chapel fell silent except for the ringing of Elena's ears and the distant sound of sirens approaching up the mountain road. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. 4 of her attackers were dead, and the rest had retreated to regroup for another assault. Elena knelt beside Carlos, checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Her friend and partner was gone, killed in a battle that had started as a wedding ceremony. Maria was also dead, her blood staining the white roses that had been scattered across the altar. Jake's voice came through her earpiece. Local law enforcement is 5 minutes out. We need to decide what happens next. Elena looked around the destroyed chapel, taking in the bullet holes in the walls, the overturned furniture, and the bodies of people who had come here to kill her. She thought about David and the other guests, safely hidden in the tunnel system but traumatized by what they had witnessed. She thought about the information hidden in her safe house, intelligence that could prevent countless deaths but had already cost the lives of 2 of the best people she had ever known. And she thought about the choice she had to make: disappear again and keep running, or trust the system she had once served to protect her and the people she cared about. The decision would shape everything that came next in this deadly game that had started with a wedding and was ending with a war zone in the Rocky Mountains. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as Elena made the most important decision of her life. She could run, disappear into the wilderness like she had done so many times before, or she could finally stop running and trust that the truth would be enough to protect the people she cared about. She chose to stay. When the first Colorado State Police officers reached the chapel 20 minutes later, they found a scene that looked like a war zone. Elena sat on the front steps, still wearing her bullet-torn wedding dress, her hands raised in surrender as Jake emerged from the forest with his hands up as well. The bodies of 6 armed men lay scattered around the chapel, along with Elena's fallen teammates Carlos and Maria. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been a law enforcement officer for 32 years, but he had never seen anything like the scene at the mountain wedding chapel. The initial reports from the 9/11 calls had been confusing and contradictory. Wedding guests spoke of gunmen bursting into a ceremony, of the bride pulling a weapon and engaging in a firefight, of explosions and smoke and people running for their lives. Elena identified herself truthfully for the first time in 3 years, giving Sheriff Bradley her real name and her former government identification numbers. She requested immediate contact with FBI agent Sarah Martinez in Denver, the only person in law enforcement that Elena trusted with the full truth about what had happened. While they waited for the FBI to arrive, Elena was allowed to speak briefly with David and the other wedding guests who had survived the attack. The conversation took place in the main lodge under police supervision, and it was one of the most difficult conversations of Elena's life. David looked at her with eyes full of hurt and betrayal. The man she had fallen in love with was trying to understand how the woman he thought he knew could be someone completely different. "So everything was a lie?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Your name, your job, your family? Everything?" "Not everything," Elena said softly. "My feelings for you were real. That was the only thing that was completely true." David's mother sat quietly in the corner, still in shock from the violence she had witnessed. Marcus and Jennifer held each other tightly, both of them trying to process how their friend's wedding had turned into a nightmare. Father Rodriguez kept shaking his head, mumbling prayers under his breath. "Those men," Marcus said finally. "They were there to kill you?" Elena nodded. "I have information that threatens some very dangerous people. They've been hunting me for 3 years."
"And you brought them here?" Jennifer's voice was sharp with anger. "You put all of us in danger because of your past?" Elena had no defense against that accusation because it was true.
She had put innocent people in danger, and 2 good people had died because of her choices. The fact that she had tried to protect everyone didn't change the reality of what had happened. "I thought I could control the situation," Elena said. "I thought my team and I could handle the threat without anyone else getting hurt. I was wrong." Agent Sarah Martinez arrived with a full FBI tactical team just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Elena had worked with Martinez years earlier on a joint task force, and she was one of the few people in law enforcement who knew about Elena's classified background. The debriefing took place in a secure trailer that the FBI had brought up the mountain. Elena spent 6 hours explaining everything. Her real identity as Elena Vasquez, her background in black operations, the mission that had gone wrong in Eastern Europe, and the criminal organization that had been hunting her ever since. The information Elena carried wasn't just valuable, it was explosive. She had detailed records of arms sales to terrorist organizations, money laundering operations, and the identities of corrupt officials in 3 different countries. The criminal network she had been running from was responsible for supplying weapons used in terrorist attacks around the world. "We've been trying to penetrate this organization for 2 years, Agent Martinez explained. "Your intelligence could shut down their entire operation and save thousands of lives." But Elena was no longer thinking about the larger implications. She was thinking about Carlos and Maria, whose bodies were being loaded into coroner's vans outside. She was thinking about David, who could barely look at her anymore. She was thinking about the wedding guests who would probably have nightmares for years about what they had witnessed. "I want protective custody for David and the others," Elena said. "If any of these criminals survive, they might target the witnesses." Agent Martinez nodded. "We're already arranging that." "But Elena, we need you to testify. This information isn't enough by itself. We need someone who can explain how it was gathered and verify its authenticity in court." Elena understood what that meant. Instead of disappearing and starting a new life somewhere else, she would be stepping into the spotlight as the star witness in what would certainly be one of the largest international criminal cases in recent history. Her face would be in newspapers and on television. Her real name would be public record. She would never be able to hide again. "What about the surviving members of the organization?" Elena asked. "If I testify publicly, they'll know exactly where to find me." "Witness protection," Martinez replied. "New identity, new location, complete security. But Elena, once you enter the program, you can never go back to your old life. You can never contact David or anyone else from your past." Elena looked out the window of the trailer, where she could see David sitting on the lodge steps with his head in his hands. He was still wearing his wedding tuxedo, though it was now stained with smoke and dirt from their escape through the tunnel. She had destroyed his life by bringing her past into his world, and now she had to choose between saving thousands of strangers and having any chance of rebuilding what they had lost. The choice was easier than she thought it would be. Over the next few days, as the FBI investigation expanded, the true scope of the criminal organization became clear. Elena's intelligence led to simultaneous raids in 12 countries, resulting in the arrest of over 40 suspects and the seizure of enough weapons to supply a small army. Bank accounts totaling over $200 million were frozen, and several planned terrorist attacks were prevented, but the personal cost continued to grow. David refused to see Elena again before she entered witness protection. He told Agent Martinez that he needed time to process everything that had happened, and that he wasn't sure he could ever trust Elena again. The other wedding guests were struggling with trauma and anger, and several of them blamed Elena for putting them in danger. On Elena's last night before entering witness protection, she was allowed to attend the funeral service for Carlos and Maria. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by a few former colleagues who knew their real identities. Elena stood between their caskets, wearing a simple black dress instead of the wedding gown that had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Jake, who had also agreed to testify and enter witness protection, spoke at the service about their fallen teammates. "Carlos and Maria died protecting innocent people," he said. "They died doing what they always did, fighting to make the world a little bit safer for everyone else." Elena couldn't speak at the service. Her grief was too raw, her guilt too overwhelming. She had led her friends into a battle that she could have avoided by simply disappearing when she first realized she was being hunted. Instead, she had tried to have a normal life, tried to find love and happiness while carrying secrets that made such things impossible. After the service, Elena was driven to a safe house where she would spend her final night as Elena Vasquez. Tomorrow, she would become someone new, with a different name and a different life. She would live in a place where no one knew about the wedding that became a war zone, or the friends who had died protecting her secrets. That night, Elena sat alone in the safe house and wrote a letter she would never be allowed to send. It was addressed to David, and it contained all the things she wished she could have said during their brief, painful conversations after the attack. She wrote about how she had fallen in love with his kindness and his laugh. She wrote about how she had imagined a future where they would grow old together, maybe have children, maybe travel the world, taking photographs of beautiful places instead of running from beautiful memories. She wrote about how sorry she was for bringing danger into his life and how she hoped someday he would be able to forgive her. Most of all, she wrote about how the 8 months they had spent together were the happiest of her life, even though they had been built on lies she thought were necessary to keep him safe. When Elena finished the letter, she burned it in the fireplace of the safe house. Some words were too dangerous to exist, even undelivered. Some truths were too painful to preserve. The next morning, Elena Vasquez disappeared forever, replaced by a woman with a new name who would spend the rest of her life living under the protection of the government she had once served. The world was safer because of her sacrifice, but the price had been everything she had ever wanted for herself. Catherine Wells stood at the window of her small coastal house, holding a letter she had written and rewritten dozens of times over the past month. The letter was addressed to David Chen at his apartment in Denver, and it contained 3 years of words she had been forbidden to say. Agent Martinez had made it clear that contacting David would be a violation of the Witness Protection Agreement and could result in Catherine losing federal protection entirely. But the capture of Victor Petrov and the exposure of the conspiracy within the Marshal Service had eliminated the immediate threat to her safety. For the first time since the chapel attack, Catherine was free to make choices based on her heart instead of her survival. The letter began simply, "David, this is Elena. I know I have no right to contact you after everything I put you through, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." Catherine had spent weeks debating whether to send the letter. She had imagined every possible response, from David refusing to see her to David having moved on completely with someone new. The uncertainty was agonizing, but the silence was worse. What finally convinced Catherine to take the risk was a conversation she'd had with Mrs. Dahl, Chen, David's mother, who had been tracking him down through social media after months of careful research. Chen had been posting photos of David at family gatherings, and Catherine could see in his eyes the same emptiness that she felt every day. The plan Catherine developed was simple but terrifying. She would drive to Denver, deliver the letter in person, and give David the choice of whether to see her again. If he refused, she would respect his decision and disappear from his life forever. If he was willing to listen, she would tell him everything she couldn't say during their brief conversations after the chapel attack. Agent Martinez tried to talk Catherine out of the trip. "You're risking everything you've built," Martinez warned. "Catherine Wells has a good life, friends, a job she loves. Elena Vasquez has nothing but painful memories and enemies who want her dead. But Elena Vasquez also has the only love that ever mattered to her," Catherine replied. "I've spent 3 years being safe and lonely. I want to find out if I can be happy instead." Catherine gave her notice at the library, telling her co-workers that she was moving back east to care for a sick relative. The story was close enough to the truth. She was going back to reclaim something she had lost, something that might be dying without her care. The drive from Northern California to Denver took her through some of the most beautiful landscape in the country. But Catherine barely noticed the scenery. Her mind was focused on the conversation she hoped to have, the explanation she owed, and the possibility that David might forgive her for the lies that had shaped their entire relationship. Catherine had researched David's life extensively before making the trip. He had been promoted at his software company but had turned down several opportunities that would have required him to relocate. He lived alone in the same apartment they had shared briefly before the wedding, and according to his social media accounts, he hadn't dated anyone seriously since the chapel attack. On the surface, David appeared to be functioning normally. He went to work, spent time with friends, posted occasional photos of hiking trips and family dinners. But Catherine could see the difference in his eyes, the guardedness that hadn't been there before, the way he smiled for photos without the joy reaching his face. Catherine arrived in Denver on a Thursday afternoon and checked into a hotel near David's office building. She planned to approach him after work, in a public place where he would feel safe and could easily leave if he didn't want to talk to her. Standing across the street from David's building at 5:30 in the evening, Catherine felt more nervous than she had during the chapel attack. Facing armed criminals had been terrifying, but at least she had known what to expect. This conversation with David was completely unknown territory. David emerged from the building exactly when Catherine expected, walking with the same purposeful stride she remembered. He looked older, more serious, but seeing him again made Catherine's heart race just like it had when they first met. She waited until he was halfway down the block before crossing the street to intercept him. "David," she called softly when she was close enough for him to hear. David stopped walking and turned around slowly, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been pain. For a long moment, they stood on the busy sidewalk while people walked around them. Two people whose love had been destroyed by circumstances neither of them had been able to control. "Elena," David said finally. "Or should I call you Catherine? I never know which name is real anymore." "My real name is Elena," she replied. "Catherine Wells was just another mask I had to wear to stay alive." David nodded, looking tired. "Agent Martinez told me you were safe, but I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Can we talk?" Elena asked, holding up the letter she had written. "Somewhere private? I have a lot of things I need to explain." David hesitated, and Elena could see the war between curiosity and self-protection playing out across his features. Finally, he gestured towards a small coffee shop at the end of the block. 20 minutes, he said. "That's all I can handle." They sat at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them, while Elena tried to explain 3 years of her life in 20 minutes. She told David about her real background, about the mission that had gone wrong, about the choice she had made to testify and enter witness protection.
I thought about contacting you every day, Elena said.
"I wanted to call you, to write to you, to somehow let you know that everything I felt for you was real, but I couldn't risk putting you in more danger." David listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral. When Elena finished talking, he sat quietly for several minutes before responding. "I believe that you loved me," David said finally. "I even believe that you thought you were protecting me by lying about who you were. But Elena, our entire relationship was built on deception. How am I supposed to trust anything you tell me now?" Elena had expected this question, but hearing it still felt like a physical blow. "I don't know if you can," she admitted. "I don't know if I can prove to you that the woman you fell in love with was real, even though everything else was fake. The woman I fell in love with was named Sarah Mitchell," David said quietly. "She was a photographer who liked hiking and homemade pasta and quiet Sunday mornings. She had a sister named Maria and an uncle named Carlos. She had never killed anyone or been shot at or lived under a false identity." "Sarah Mitchell was everything I wanted to be," Elena replied. "She was who I would have been if I had never worked for the government, never gotten involved with criminals, never had to run for my life. When I was with you, I could pretend to be her." David shook his head. "That's exactly the problem. You were pretending. Even when you said you loved me, you were pretending to be someone else." Elena felt tears starting to form, but she blinked them back. She had known this conversation might be the end of any hope for reconciliation, but she had needed to try. "What do you want from me, Elena?" David asked, and his voice was gentler now, though still guarded. "What did you hope would happen when you came here?" "I wanted to apologize," Elena said. "I wanted to explain why I made the choices I made, and I wanted to ask if there was any chance that we could start over, knowing the truth this time." David looked out the window of the coffee shop, watching people walk past on their way to normal lives with normal problems. "I've been going to therapy," he said. "Trying to work through what happened at the chapel, trying to understand how I could have been so completely wrong about someone I thought I knew." "What has your therapist told you?" Elena asked. "That I need to decide whether I can forgive you for lying to me, and whether I can trust you to tell me the truth going forward." David met Elena's eyes across the table. "I haven't been able to answer either of those questions." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small box. "I brought something that belongs to you," she said, sliding the box across the table. David opened the box and found the engagement ring he had given her 8 months before the chapel attack. The ring Elena had been wearing when she pulled a gun from her bouquet and started a firefight during their wedding ceremony. "I never stopped wearing it," Elena said quietly. "Even in witness protection, even when I was Catherine Wells living a completely different life. I wore it on a chain around my neck, under my clothes, where no one could see it." David picked up the ring, turning it over in his fingers. "Why are you giving it back to me?" "Because I want to earn it again," Elena said. "If you'll let me. If you think there's any chance that we could build something real this time, based on truth instead of lies." David was quiet for a long time, studying the ring and thinking about the choice Elena was offering him. He could walk away, continue with his life in Denver, and try to forget about the woman who had lied to him and then disappeared. Or he could take the enormous risk of trusting her again, knowing that she would always carry the weight of a violent past. "I would need time," David said finally, "and complete honesty about everything. No more secrets, no more lies, no matter how small." Elena felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. "Does that mean you're willing to try?" "It means I'm willing to consider it," David replied. But Elena, if we do this, if we try to build something together, you have to promise me that there won't be any more gunfights at family gatherings. For the first time in 3 years, Elena laughed. It was a small laugh, tentative and fragile, but it was real. I promise, she said. Catherine Wells was a librarian. Elena Vasquez is retired from the violence business. David slipped the engagement ring into his pocket, not putting it back on Elena's finger, but not giving it back to her either. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. We can talk about what happens next. Elena nodded, understanding that this was the beginning of a long process of rebuilding trust and discovering whether their love was strong enough to survive the truth. As she watched David walk away down the Denver street, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning of their wedding day. Hope for a future that included happiness instead of just survival. 6 months later, Elena and David had their second wedding ceremony. It was a small gathering at a courthouse in Denver, with only David's family and a few close friends in attendance. Agent Martinez served as Elena's witness, and there were no weapons hidden in anyone's clothing. Elena wore a simple blue dress instead of white, and David wore the same suit he had worn to their first wedding. When the judge asked if anyone objected to the marriage, everyone in the small room held their breath for a moment before laughing at their collective nervousness. The chapel in the mountains had been rebuilt, but Elena and David would never return there. Some places held too much pain to revisit, even in the name of healing. Instead, they chose to create new memories in new places, building a life based on the truth about who they really were. Eleanor never returned to government work, and she never had to use the skills that had once made her so dangerous. She opened a small photography studio in Denver, finally becoming the Sarah Mitchell she had once pretended to be. David kept his job at the software company, and they bought a small house with a garden where Elena could grow the vegetables she used in the homemade pasta that had been one of the few true things about their original relationship. They visited Carlos and Maria's graves every year on the anniversary of the chapel attack, bringing flowers and sharing stories about the happiness they had found together. Elena never stopped feeling responsible for their deaths, but she learned to carry that guilt alongside her gratitude for the life their sacrifice had made possible. Some endings are about justice being served and criminals being punished. But this ending was about love surviving the worst circumstances imaginable, about two people choosing to trust each other despite every reason not to, and about the possibility that even the most damaged hearts can heal when they find the right person to help them remember what hope feels like. Elena and David Chen lived quietly and happily for the rest of their lives, two people who had learned that the most powerful weapon against darkness is the choice to love someone completely, truthfully, and without reservation. And sometimes that choice is brave enough to win.